Good morning, everybody. I'll speak in English in honor to our guest speaker, Michael Leigh. Let me start by thanking the sponsors of the annual program seminars of the Cardozo Foundations, whose logo marks are exhibited in front of me and behind me in those screens. Michael, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us again. First time you came here, I guess it was September 2016.
Right.
3 months after Brexit and 2 months before Trump. So, and the question in those days, what the hell is going on, right? And I think now we know a little bit more what the hell is going on, but we still don't know where we are heading to. So that's why we invited you back to the foundation to shed light on the future of the United Kingdom in Europe and the world.
No.
So
All that
easy task. Well, we couldn't find someone more knowledgeable than you to speak about this complex topics. Michael, for those who don't know him yet, was in his first incarnation an academic, master's from Oxford University, PhD from the MIT. Then Michael entered the European Union and went up all the way up the institutional ladder, and was Director General. Held key positions in the European Union. I would underline the position of Director General for the enlargement of the European Union, helped the European Union to move to the east, and encompassing the former countries of East Europe, beyond the Iron Curtain. Now you're back to academic life, teaching at Johns Hopkins University in Bologna, Italy. They have 2 campuses, one in Washington, the other in Bologna. So, well, you have all the credentials to talk about the very opportune topic that we have in front of us. So the floor is yours for about 45 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A session with all of you here. Michael, thank you so much.
Sergio, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be back at the foundation after 3 years.
Closer to the mic, please.
And I'm only sorry that the occasion for my being here is a subject which, let me put my cards on the table immediately, is one that causes me quite grave concern. I really have to say at the beginning that as somebody who worked for more than 3 decades for the European institutions, I am convinced that the European project has been to the benefit of the peoples of Europe, including the United Kingdom, and indeed for partners around the world. And it is a subject of regret to me to see, in Brussels, we have this way of speaking about the country we come from as the country I know best, because the theory is that EU officials must neither seek, when they take office, they must swear they will neither seek nor accept instructions from any country. So when they talk about their own country, the phrase they use is not my country, but the country I know best. So now, sadly, when I refer to the United Kingdom, I find myself saying the country I used to know best, because the transformation the last few years has been very great. And I regret to say, too, that I feel that it is part of a wider wave, which is known as populism in some quarters, although we could debate the meaning of populism. And therefore, please, when you hear my remarks, you must consider that I am not fully objective. So I'm also emotional when I approach the subject. So take what I say with a pinch of salt. That being said, today I want to cover two main subjects. First of all, Brexit itself, how it came about, and what its implications are, and how it may develop. And then scenarios for the future of Europe, considering the impact of Brexit, but also how Brexit feeds into wider developments that are likely to determine how the European Union evolves in the year ahead, in the years ahead. And then, if we have time remaining, as Sergio suggested, we might also touch on a recent development of particular interest, I think, here in Brazil, namely the recently concluded, or rather negotiated, EU-Mercosur agreement that still needs, in fact, to be finalized, to be signed and ratified. But if we have time, we may touch on that as well. Let me first begin with the question of how Brexit arose in the first place. And I'd like to be clear that, in my view, there was nothing inevitable about Brexit. Some people would claim that Britain was always semi-detached, that Britain never fully accepted the notion of European integration, and that therefore sooner or later this was going to happen. Some Europeans often referred to the United Kingdom as perfidious Albion. They thought that the United Kingdom was acting, to change the metaphor, as a Trojan horse within the European Union, representing the interests of the United States or the English-speaking world. But having worked for the European Union for more than 30 years, I am myself convinced that there was really nothing inevitable about this. Nonetheless, there's a strong current of feeling that British insularity and exceptionalism made this almost inevitable. And if you'll forgive the very old joke about all of this, which se non è vero è ben trovato, was the headline in the Times newspaper years and years ago, fog in the English Channel, continent isolated. This being a British perception of things. And therefore, the idea that given this mentality, sooner or later, something like Brexit was going to happen. I don't share this view. I wrote an article the year before I came here last time in 2015, which I called The European Union Made in Britain, which was a bit of an exaggeration, but it pointed out the number of core EU policies that exist as a result of British membership and through British influence, starting first of all with the single market itself, which was a project strongly supported by Margaret Thatcher and by the commissioner that she sent to Brussels, Arthur Cockfield, who worked hand in hand with Jacques Delors, the then Commission President from France, to get rid of obstacles to free movement in Europe. This was essentially a British liberal project, if you like. And we look across the EU from areas as different as development assistance to fisheries policy, the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific agreement with countries around the world, any number of policy areas, the reform of the EU institutions, the introduction of newfangled ideas like transparency and accountability, which had been rather absent previously, Britain left a very strong mark. So despite its insularity and exceptionalism, I don't think there was anything inevitable about Brexit. And Brexit came about, in my view, first and foremost because of leadership failures. We can debate this a little later, and maybe it needs diluting. But when you look back over the last few years and the policies pursued by a series of British leaders, starting with David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister, and his decision to call a referendum in 2016. He had promised that in the previous election campaign, but he never thought he would have to carry out this project. He never expected to win the election. He thought that probably he'd have to form another coalition with the Liberal Democrats who are pro-European and who would have prevented a referendum from taking place. And he probably thought also that if there were a referendum in the end, he would win it, just as the referendum in Scotland on independence had been won by those in favour of keeping the United Kingdom together. So the first leadership failure was his disastrous and unnecessary decision to call the referendum. The second failure was Thereza May's bungled approach to the negotiations. We can see now that she committed a series of fundamental errors. You know, at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I'm teaching, we have a module on negotiating technique. And what you don't do at the very, very beginning, before the negotiations have even begun, is to reveal your bottom line to your negotiating partner. And quite unnecessarily, at the beginning of this process, she laid down red lines. No jurisdiction in the future for the European Court of Justice, no significant payments into the EU budget, no participation in the single market, no participation in the customs union after Brexit. And having laid down those red lines, there was almost nothing left to negotiate, and her hands were tied. So I think she made any number of errors for similar motives to those of David Cameron. She believed that by taking a very strong line like this, she could immediately neutralize the effect of very strong pro-Brexit figures in her own party and to the right. But one of the lessons learned from this experience is that if you throw red meat to extremists, you just increase their appetite. And this is, in fact, what happened. And then Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, also carries a very heavy responsibility for what has taken place. He is the leader of a party, 2/3 of whose members are in favour of remaining in the European Union. By the way, the British Labour Party now has the highest membership of any political party in Western Europe, over 500,000 members, 2/3 of whom would be in favour of remaining. And similarly, 2/3 of Labour MPs were in favour of remaining. But in the referendum, 2/3 of the constituencies where Labour Party members had been elected to Parliament voted to leave. So I must recognise that he had a difficult hand to play. But nonetheless, he remained ambiguous throughout. If early on he'd taken a clear position, either in the referendum campaign itself against leaving the European Union, or subsequently in favour of a soft Brexit in which the UK would remain part of the single market, then the outcome would have been very different. After leadership failures, I think that another factor that contributed to the outcome was what I'm calling defective democracy. There are debates now throughout the democratic world about whether we are witnessing failures of democracy. And I think one can say that what we've seen in the United Kingdom over the last 3 years, in a way, indicates defective democracy. First of all, the referendum campaign itself. It's clear that it was very ill-informed, and the claims that were made particularly by those in favour of leave, but not properly countered by those in favour of remain, were clearly based on lies and distortions. As a political scientist, I have to recognize that the truth, is not something that exists in a limpid, crystal clear form, and that politicians are always said to be economical with the truth. But the kind of claims that were made during the referendum campaign were palpable and provable lies, for which no one was ever held responsible in the end. The Remain campaign was very poorly led, with no clear message, no vision as to why it was in the interest of the United Kingdom to remain part of the European Union. Instead, this was described by some as Project Fear, arousing fears about the consequences of leaving, not giving a positive vision as to the benefits. And so this contributed. We now know that there were very significant financial abuses. And in fact, the Vote Leave campaign was found guilty in a court of law of certain financial abuses, and to this day, it's not clear what is the source of some of the funding for that campaign, which seems to have come from abroad, at least to a certain extent. So I think the way in which this campaign was run contributed to the outcome. The referendum itself was rather odd in a number of respects. First of all, the result was scarcely decisive. Of course, in democracies, one has to accept the outcome, even if it's rather marginal. But in fact, just under 52% of those voting voted in favour of leave, and they constituted just 37% of the eligible electorate, scarcely decisive. In most, not only democratic countries, but constitutional countries, when a major constitutional change is proposed, there is usually a high threshold. It's very frequent, for example, that you need a two-thirds majority of the legislature for a constitutional change in many countries. In this case, there was no threshold whatsoever in the referendum, no minimum that was required. For example, when the European Union organized a referendum in what was then Serbia and Montenegro about separation and the creation of two independent states, the European Union coordinator of this process took a high risk in saying that the threshold for this referendum to be valid would be a 55% vote. If it had been 54.5, it was tricky. There was a decisive outcome, and it worked. There was no threshold in this debate. No supermajority was required. And finally, and quite differently from the Scottish referendum the year before, young people were not permitted to vote. There was a restricted franchise. In the Scottish referendum, young people over the age of 16 were allowed to vote, but they were not allowed to vote in the EU referendum. Had they done so, the result would have been different, as predominantly young people are in favour of remaining and older people are in favour of leaving. I could go on. Another interesting anomaly that might not have changed the outcome, but who knows, is the fact that Commonwealth citizens living in the UK could vote in this referendum, but EU citizens could not, unless, even if they were permanent residents of the United Kingdom, unless they were from Malta, Cyprus, or Ireland. Malta and Cyprus as Commonwealth countries, and Ireland because there's a standing arrangement of mutual permission to participate in elections. So just, I don't want to go on in great detail about this, but it was rather odd, the conditions under which the referendum was held. And then, following the referendum, the nature of the debate and discussion, particularly in the media, both the social media, where there were the famous echo chambers reinforcing the messages of the Leave campaign, but also in the classic media, the written press, which is predominantly pro-Leave, and this famous headline in the Daily Mail at the time when a citizen took a case to justice arguing that the mother of all parliaments, the British House of Commons, should have the right to vote, to have a meaningful vote on the results of the negotiations for Brexit, because the government had no intention of putting this to the House of Commons. They would conduct the negotiation and then, using executive power, simply implement it. And when the Supreme Court of the UK, a relatively new institution, reached the judgment that Parliament needed to have a meaningful vote, this was condemned by the British press, and we had this headline in the Daily Mail with photographs of the judges. It just stopped short, and I'm exaggerating here, of giving their private names and addresses and inviting the public to do whatever they would to express their discontent. They didn't go quite that far. But they were branded enemies of the people. And I think this is symptomatic of Brexit being populism with British characteristics, because we see throughout Europe, wherever leaders can accurately be described as populist, they claim to be the only true embodiment of the will of the people. And anybody taking a different view, even a legal institution of the country, such as the Supreme Court, that takes a different view, is branded as being an enemy of the people. And those of us old enough or who have studied long enough know perfectly well what the origins of this phrase is, whether you go back to Ibsen or to Stalin or Hitler or Mao Zedong, or for that matter, Steven Spielberg in the film Jaws. Whoever speaks the truth but goes against the drift of thinking of the regime in power may be branded as enemy of the people. But the fact that this could take place in the United Kingdom, of all places, I think is deeply shocking. I'm spending much of my time now in Italy, and my Italian friends say, well, we could expect this sort of thing in Italy, but surely not in the United Kingdom. But another important explanatory factor to all of this is English nationalism. And Boris Johnson, who has now promised, do or die, to quote him, that Britain will leave on the 31st of October, is actually expressing a point of view that is strongly held in England, but not in Scotland or in Northern Ireland, that voted to remain. And one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the phenomena that helped to explain the outcome, is a split in opinion between the different parts of the United Kingdom, which I think bodes ill for the future. But we'll touch on that a little later. Now, what I've said about leadership failings and defective democracy contributing to the Brexit outcome has to be weighed against a reality, which is the deep division of British society on this matter. And I think what we're witnessing in the UK are cleavages between young and old, between urban and rural, between those in well-paid jobs and those with precarious, poorly paid jobs, to the point that society itself is deeply divided. This was the case before the referendum and even more after the referendum. So I have to acknowledge that even with first-class leadership, it was going to be very difficult to cope with these very deep divisions. In fact, one French commentator recently compared the situation to France in the 1890s, when society was divided over the Dreyfus case, and people identified themselves as either Dreyfusards or anti-Dreyfusards. and society as a whole was split along these lines. I think something similar is occurring in the United Kingdom, and therefore I must recognize that it would have been difficult under any circumstances for a leader to persist with a very strong and clear line. Nonetheless, I believe if some of those leadership ambiguities had not been there, the outcome would probably have been different. So against this background, what can we expect? There are basically 3 or perhaps 4, depending on how you view it, outcomes possible at this stage. The first outcome is that Britain leaves on the 31st of October with an agreement. This is something that Boris Johnson claims that he magically is going to be able to achieve, even though the existing agreement concluded by his predecessor has been rejected by the House of Commons 3 times, and the Europeans have indicated their unwillingness to renegotiate. But nonetheless, he makes this claim. The second outcome is that Britain will leave on the 31st of October with no agreement, the famous no-deal Brexit. At the moment, this would seem to be the more probable outcome. The third is that Brexit would again be postponed. This is not the position at the time being of the government, but who knows? When the deadline looms and when the business community and others make very clear their discontent with the situation, and when it turns out that the warnings of chaos are not just project fear, but are realities, nobody can exclude that the government might, at the last moment, request a further postponement. But as Mr. President Macron has pointed out today, the EU would only consider a postponement if there were a good reason. And what might constitute a good reason would be an election or the holding of another referendum, serious negotiations being entered into, or if, as seems highly unlikely, the UK decided to revoke its notification of its intention to leave the European Union. Very, very subjectively, I've attached these probabilities to the outcome. It seems to me extremely unlikely that Britain now could leave on the 31st of October with an agreement. I would say the most likely outcome at this point is that Britain would leave with no agreement, and there's a certain possibility that it might be again postponed. But one thing I should make clear is that even on this second outcome, I am convinced that British negotiators would be back in Brussels within days, because chaos will be a reality. Trade will be blocked. There will be huge hold-ups at borders, particularly at Dover, the port through which most trade with the continent takes place. There will be problems with the right of planes to fly to European destinations and to land in the United Kingdom. There are concerns about the availability of pharmaceuticals, medicines, any number of consequences. So I think even in the event of a no-deal Brexit, negotiations will resume rather quickly. And on the European side too, there will be interest in trying to limit the damage. So even in this event, I think there would be further negotiations, and this would not be the end of the story. The impact of Brexit will be felt first and foremost in the United Kingdom itself, but there will also be a serious impact on the European Union. In the United Kingdom, I've already hinted at part of the impact, and that is the uncertain future of the United Kingdom itself. I think that questioning the outcome is most likely to come from Northern Ireland in the short run, and not so much from Scotland, although there could well be further effects in Scotland too. one must remember that Northern Ireland voted in favour of Remain, that the border has been open now for 20 years, that this forms an inherent part of the Good Friday Agreement concluded now more than 20 years ago, that brought to an end the troubles in Ireland, the violence that there had been previously. And also, let's face it, that living standards in the Republic of Ireland are higher than in Northern Ireland, and also that demography in Northern Ireland is shifting with the proportion of the population that is Catholic increasing, either because of immigration or because of birth rates or other factors. And therefore, I think the people of Northern Ireland are going to ask themselves why they should be obliged to pull out of the European Union and find themselves confronted with a hard border with the Republic when they had actually voted against this. And if Northern Ireland were to move towards Irish unity, definitely in Scotland questions would be asked too. And in fact, even if an agreement were to be concluded which gave a special status to Northern Ireland in remaining within de facto the single market and the customs union to avoid a hard border in Ireland, people in Scotland would say, how come we who also voted to remain are not in this position as well? I think the UK will also run into serious difficulties with its vision of global Britain. Perhaps we'll come back to this if you like in the Q&A, but everybody is aware that the vision of Britain unleashed, able to negotiate favorable trade agreements with countries all over the world, beginning with the United States, with Commonwealth countries and so on, is likely to find itself faced with many, many obstacles. I won't go into that in more detail now, but this is pretty clear. The economic impact is considerable. Economists differ in their estimates, but probably the British economy is performing at a level of perhaps 1.5% or 2% GDP below where it might have been otherwise. And there is the risk of major industrial enterprises, particularly in the car industry, deciding to shift to the continent. We haven't seen these moves yet because Brexit's not a reality yet. It hasn't happened. The financial services sector and others also likely to see some drift towards Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin, and indeed New York. For the European Union, the impact will be considerable as well. In economic terms, as Britain is a very significant market for exporters in the EU, although a less significant one than the EU is for British exporters, but also in broader terms, as the EU has ambitions to develop, for example, a common foreign and security policy without Britain, one of only 2 member states who are permanent members of the Security Council, one of only 2 member states with the capacity to project power, military power, beyond the immediate environment of Europe. How could the European Union seriously expect to develop a common defense and security policy without Britain? In economic terms, Britain is, depending on how you calculate it, the 6th largest economy in the world. The loss of Britain, the loss of clout in international trade negotiations would also be considerable. So the impact will be far greater on the UK, but the impact will be there in the EU too. One early fear that has not materialized is the fear of contagion from Brexit to other member states. Matteo Salvini, before he entered government, before the last Italian election in 2018, was wearing a T-shirt proclaiming that Italy should leave the euro. There was speculation about Ital exit, about Frexit, about Grexit, and so on. None of that has become a reality. And in fact, opinion in other member states has been chastened by what has happened in Britain. They have seen the mess the Brits have made of it for themselves. And even Marine Le Pen, who in the last presidential election campaign in France was arguing for a French referendum on continued membership of the euro and perhaps of EU membership has learned that this doesn't go down very well with French public opinion and has backed off from that. So the heaviest impact will fall on the UK, but there will also be an impact on the European Union itself. You said 40 minutes, 45 minutes, so...
Yeah, you still have 15 minutes
okay.
more. Yeah.
Allow me then to come to the second major topic I wanted to discuss with you against the background of Brexit, and that is what all of this means for the future of the European Union and how we can expect to see the EU develop in the years ahead. Perhaps with some simplification, I'm presenting this to you in terms of three scenarios. The first scenario being a relaunch of the European project. This is a scenario put forward most forcefully by the French President Emmanuel Macron in a series of major speeches that he's given after taking office and that he's maintained subsequently. The second scenario is disintegration and possibly collapse of the European Union, a scenario which is not purely academic, but which even mainstream leaders have discussed and that you can read being talked about in the press on any day of the week. And a third scenario that I'm calling consolidation, one which is neither relaunch nor disintegration, but really is a policy more based on holding on to what we've got rather than relaunch or disintegration. As I've said, the main advocate of the first scenario is Macron. And in his various speeches, he developed a number of themes as to how he sees Europe being relaunched, first and foremost by completing the governance of the Eurozone, which is still very deficient, completing the banking union, bringing fiscal policy as well as monetary policy within the purview of the monetary union. He's developed this notion of a Europe that protects, and I think by that he means both economically, it's not protectionism, but a Europe that protects. In other words, appealing to those who see themselves as the victims of globalization, putting into place policies that would take into account their interests, but also a Europe that protects in the sense of the security of the citizen. Asylum and border protection. One of the main crises of the EU in recent years has been over migration and asylum policy, where we do have open internal borders, but we don't have a common approach to external border controls, and we don't have a single unified asylum policy. And finally, to defend democracy. He's put forward the notion that there should be a kind of EU democracy agency to monitor the state of democracy in our own member states. Rule of law, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe, but also democracy failings elsewhere. An extremely ambitious agenda that would see the European project being relaunched. And for this, he counts on the new leadership that is in the process of being put in place in Brussels to implement this relaunch agenda. Here you have the photos of those who are about to take over the leadership of the EU institutions. Charles Michel, the acting Belgian Prime Minister, who will become President of the EU Council of Ministers, Ursula von der Leyen, who until now has been German Defense Minister, Christian Democrat, Charles Michel, by the way, Liberal, previous Labour and Family and Defense Minister in Germany, Christine Lagarde, until now Managing Director of the IMF, who will have an 8-year term as President of the European Central Bank, Josep Borrell from Catalonia, from Spain, currently, until recently, Spanish Foreign Minister, previous President of the European Parliament, who will become the High Representative for Foreign Policy, and David Maria Sassoli, who will become the new socialist president of the European Parliament for the next 2.5 years. The choice of these individuals was not self-evident. Some claim that they're the C team, not the A team. There was a need to balance gender, to balance political orientation, to include the major political families. It's striking that there are some gaps in this leadership. The Greens, who did very well in the European Parliament election, are not represented, and there is no one from Central and Eastern Europe either, which perhaps is one of the factors that has led to the candidacy of Kristalina Georgieva, until now the CEO of the World Bank and a previous European commissioner from Bulgaria, to be the European candidate as the new managing director of the IMF. So Macron and this team will be those advocating relaunch. But there's very strong opposition, mainly from extreme nationalist and populist leaders around the European Union who are not favorable to this agenda, who think more in terms of a Europe of nations and do not support Macron's efforts to give new energy to the European project. The second scenario is disintegration, or one could say collapse. And just to show you that I haven't invented this purely for the purpose of presenting distinct scenarios, if you Google this subject, or if you look at the syllabuses for various courses on European integration today, you will see that a whole literature has developed on the risks of disintegration. Think tankers, academics, even Krastov, perhaps one of the most original thinkers about European integration from Bulgaria, who heads an institute in Vienna, wrote this book, After Europe, in which he attributes to migration the main factor determining outcomes in Europe, and even claiming that migration has replaced social class as the main determinant of political outcomes. EU critics, like the former Greek finance minister Varoufakis, also sees this as a reality. And a recent public opinion poll showed that majorities in 11 of the 14 countries that were polled agreed with the statement that the EU could collapse over the next 20 years. George Soros, very well known here in Brazil, the Open Society Institute, has warned that the EU might be sleepwalking into oblivion, and that disintegration might occur as a result of the accumulation of diverse factors. Why do people take these views? Well, firstly, because the core achievements of the European Union seem to be at risk. The Eurozone has not been completed. There could be future crises from Italy or elsewhere. We're not yet equipped really to handle them. One of the other main achievements, now you can travel across Europe, crossing borders at 100 kilometers an hour without slowing down. Goods can be shipped from country to country without border controls. Temporary border controls were introduced after the 2015 migration crisis. So with the two core achievements of the EU at risk, this is one of the factors leading people to believe that disintegration could be a reality. And the fact that until now there were majorities in most member states strongly supporting European integration, but with the rise of nationalism and Euroscepticism, we see this challenged, even in a country like Italy, where every shoe repairer, every store assistant, when I first went to Italy and they knew that I'd come from abroad, made me a little speech about Europe. Well, today the tide of opinion has shifted even there. Also, the European Union, I think, sees itself as the main embodiment of the concept of multilateralism in the world. And yet multilateralism today is under threat, both from the United States and from other sources. So the decline of the commitment to multilateralism also is seen as a weakening factor for the European Union. This means no new grand initiatives, no treaties. in order to take a major step forward, sooner or later you need a new treaty. But European leaders are afraid today to put forward a new treaty because in most cases they have to be approved by national parliaments and sometimes by referenda. And people love saying no in referenda. So people therefore are afraid to organize any major new initiative. The federal approach has almost been abandoned. The idea that we are headed for an ever closer union, a United States of Europe, except in Belgium, of which I am now proudly a citizen as well, and maybe to some extent still in Germany, still in Luxembourg, and in some quarters, there's little, and in some smaller member states, there's little firm commitment to the vision of a federal Europe. We now see groups of states forming. For some time, the Visegrad group of 4 countries in Central Europe have tried to coordinate their policies, generally of a rather illiberal nature. But the Dutch Prime Minister, Mr. Rutte, has established another group, which some call the New Hanseatic League of northern countries, who take a strict attitude on fiscal issues, who don't want to hand out bailout money to profligate countries in southern Europe, and so on. The southern Europeans who coordinate to some extent. Another factor contributing to this vision of disintegration is interference, perceived or real, by outside powers. For example, China has established a relationship with 16 member states that is known as the 16+1 group, and which is facilitating Chinese investment in Europe, which for the time being doesn't seem to carry political strings, but who knows? Seeing the port of Piraeus and in the future the port of Trieste in Italy being rehabilitated and then run by Chinese companies is certainly something new for Europe. One of the phenomena that I was in charge of for many years in Europe that has given impetus to the European Union have been progressive enlargements, new countries queuing up to join the European Union. Well, for the time being, there's no real enlargement likely to take place for at least the next decade. And then Brexit, in the end, has challenged the notion that EU and EU membership are irreversible. Here we've got a demonstration of the fact that the phenomenon can be reversed, and this is contributing to the vision of disintegration. Well, I think most social scientists are familiar with the idea that you present 2 rather extreme scenarios and then an intermediate scenario as being the most likely eventual outcome, and I plead guilty to that. So my third scenario I am calling consolidation. And consolidation means basically neither relaunch nor collapse. It means first and foremost that we try to hold on to what we've got to prevent disintegration, to try and preserve and extend the single market rather than going for any big new grand project. It means our approach to new policy areas is a policy of small steps, not major new projects like the single currency or the single market or border-free Europe being introduced with much fanfare. And conceptually, it means cooperation rather than integration, which implies a more intergovernmental approach rather than a supranational approach. But even on this third scenario, I think we have a fairly full agenda. And there are many things that the EU can do through small steps. One example is the Eurozone budget. President Macron put forward in his Sorbonne speech and subsequent speeches the idea that the Eurozone needed to have its own budget that would be large enough to be macroeconomically significant, so that in future, if there were to be any problems of financial nature in a Eurozone country, the Eurozone itself would have the institutions and the means to intervene. This didn't happen. But in a typical EU compromise, it's been agreed that there will be a small Eurozone budget. And in the traditional Monnet method, obviously, he hopes that this could gradually be extended to become more significant in the future. Better control of external frontiers, not an EU coast guard as such, but better equipment for national coast guards, a more serious effort at external border controls, a more serious climate policy to try and ensure that EU countries can meet some of those Paris targets. Antitrust policy is one area which, even on this third scenario, is clearly an area where the EU can perform. The Danish commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, made a reputation for herself over the last 5 years she actually earned a personal word of contempt from Trump for what she has been doing to assert simple principles such as the idea that major IT companies should be taxed in the countries where they generate their profits, which has not been the case until now. They've been able to be taxed in the most favorable jurisdiction. And she's challenged, she was responsible for a 4.6 billion fine for Google. So I think that competition antitrust policy is an area where the EU will still be active. The EU is still trying to create a unified capital market in Europe instead of a series of national markets. The EU has taken the lead through the General Data Protection Regulation, and the whole field of regulation, whether of financial services or product safety and in other fields, is an area where the EU can still perform. Science and research. The EU's Horizon 2020 program, to be followed by a new program providing EU funds for science, research and innovation, is another area where the EU can continue to be active and perform, and also to work with partners around the world in the future. So the consolidation scenario is not such a poor third. Some would describe it as a typically British vision of muddling through. I think it's more than that. I think there really is substance whereby on this scenario the EU would continue to have a role. So wrapping up, as I have gone beyond the 45 minutes, what can we expect in the years ahead? Political fragmentation is a reality. The EU member states and the European Parliament will no longer be dominated by the three main parties that have been active until now, the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats on the one side, Social Democrats and Socialists on the other, who formed a grand coalition in Germany and who have determined all the key appointments in the European Union until now. We face fragmentation. In Germany, 5 or possibly 6 major parties. In the European Union, in the European Parliament, a majority now can only be formed by bringing in the Liberals and perhaps also the Greens in the future as a blocking majority against the extreme nationalists and populists. So political fragmentation. We're seeing political transition. We're going towards this much drawn-out process of succession to Angela Merkel. Who knows what that will bring? Political instability in several larger member states. Clearly in Italy, in Spain, and elsewhere, the political scene has become much less predictable. And one must acknowledge an authoritarian drift in several member states, particularly in Central Europe. Hungary and Poland have seen the EU for the first time ever institute proceedings under Article 7 of the treaty concerning violations of the rule of law in EU member states, an absolute first. So I think these trends are likely to continue. The questions we must ask: will Macron, who for the time being is the de facto leader in the absence of any other of Europe, will he succeed with at least some of his reforms? Will the EU prove resilient? Will it be able to deal with these different cross-cutting pressures? And will these new leaders that I introduced to you very briefly rise to the challenge. So I'm leaving you with questions rather than answers, but I'd be happy to engage on these questions or any other that you might like to raise. Thank you, sir.